I hadn't spoken to my family in nearly 5 years, so when my phone rang and I saw my mother's number, I was genuinely surprised. I hesitated to pick it up. After everything that had happened, after the betrayal, the heartbreak, the outright abandonment by my family, why should I answer now? But something made me do it. Maybe it was curiosity or a lingering sense of duty. Whatever it was, I finally took the call. The voice on the other end wasn't the proud, self-assured woman I remembered, but a desperate, trembling one, barely holding back tears. "Please," my mother begged, "your sister needs your help. She and her husband are going through an unimaginable crisis." The story unraveled from there, though the request for help was laughable. To understand why I hadn't spoken to them for years, I'd have to go back to the day that changed my life, the day of my engagement. Lucas and I had been together since our early days in college. It was the classic love story. We grew up together, cheered each other on, and finally, after almost 5 years of being together, Lucas proposed. It was the happiest day of my life, or so I thought. That night, he surprised me with an engagement party, a beautiful gathering where friends, family, everyone who mattered to me were there to celebrate us. It felt like a dream. Somewhere around 10 o'clock that evening, I stepped out into the backyard to get a better phone signal. That's when I saw them. My sister, Melissa, the girl I had grown up with, the one who was supposed to love and support me, was there, locked in an intense embrace with Lucas. They were so lost in each other that it took them a moment to even realize I was standing there, my heart shattered. The world went quiet, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears. When they finally looked up and saw me, the shock in their eyes quickly melted into something else, something like guilt, though it barely fazed them. I fled. I could barely see the road through my tears as I sped away to the nearest hotel. For hours, I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that what I had seen hadn't actually happened. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Melissa. She was sorry, she said, but she was in love with Lucas. She claimed it had been going on for a long time. She hadn't even pretended to regret what she'd done. No, she was only sorry that I had found out. Minutes later, Lucas's text came through as well, filled with weak explanations. He claimed he'd only proposed to me because he'd hoped that a commitment would help him push Melissa out of his mind. But it hadn't worked. If anything, it had only made him want her more. They were soulmates, he said, and I was the placeholder standing in their way. I was devastated, my heart heavy and broken. For 4 days, I hid away in that hotel, not answering a single text or call. I couldn't. I felt hollow, abandoned by two of the people I loved most. Eventually, I knew I couldn't hide forever. My job was on the line, and I needed to collect my belongings from the place we had once called our shared home. When I finally returned, I was expecting an empty house. Instead, I was greeted by a twisted family reunion. My parents, my aunt, and even Lucas were all there, waiting for me as if this was some heartwarming family reunion. My mother rushed forward to hug me, and Melissa even had the nerve to do the same, with tears glistening in her eyes. The gall of it struck me silent. I was too numb to even react. I just stood there, trying to absorb the surreal scene. Once everyone quieted down, I told them I was back only to collect my things and to leave for good. The words were barely out of my mouth when Lucas announced he'd already packed his stuff and was moving in with Melissa. And then the absurdity of it all hit me. My family, my own family, was smiling as if this whole situation was something sweet and heartwarming. My father gave a speech about how these things happen and how we couldn't change the past but had to look forward to the future. My mother wiped away a tear as she praised Lucas and Melissa's bravery in admitting their true feelings. My father actually suggested that I celebrate for my sister.
Celebrate.
For my sister, who had just stolen my fiance. The audacity was beyond anything I had ever experienced. When I expressed my disgust, my father rolled his eyes, accusing me of being childish and petty for not understanding the situation. He spoke of family duty and said it was my job to stand by my sister and her happiness. But I'd had enough. I went to my room, grabbed my essentials, and left without a word. They tried to call out to me, but I was done listening. I wanted no part of their twisted family values. In the weeks that followed, I cut off all contact with them. They reached out repeatedly, sending texts, voicemails, and even trying to show up at my work. Nothing worked. I refused to respond. A few weeks later, they even sent me an invitation to Melissa and Lucas's wedding. I laughed out loud when I saw it and threw it directly in the trash. Most of our mutual friends sided with me, refusing to attend their wedding or interact with my family. Even some of my relatives, disgusted by how I'd been treated, cut ties. For 5 years, I lived in peace, without a word from them, until now. My mother's phone call reopened old wounds, but I listened as she described Melissa and Lucas's financial ruin. They had apparently started a business together, but it failed miserably. They'd taken out loans they couldn't repay, and now they were drowning in debt. My mother was practically begging me to help, suggesting that I lend them $75,000 to save their family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After 5 years of silence, they were back, asking for my money as if nothing had happened. When I asked why Melissa hadn't reached out to me herself, my mother hesitated before admitting that neither Melissa nor Lucas knew she was calling me. Apparently, they'd forbidden her from doing so because they knew I'd never agree. And they were right. I refused outright, reminding my mother of how they'd betrayed me, how my family had taken their side and left me out in the cold. My mother then accused me of being cruel, selfish, and vindictive, warning that I'd regret my decision. I hung up, exhausted and furious. The calls didn't stop. Every few hours, my mother texted, each message more desperate than the last, pleading for me to think of my sister, to put aside petty revenge. It was all manipulation. I blocked her number, finally ready to put an end to the incessant begging. But the situation escalated beyond what I could have ever expected. A few days later, I was at work when my neighbor called, telling me that a couple was outside my house, screaming for me to come out. I immediately knew who it was, Melissa and Lucas. They'd shown up at my door, refusing to leave, and were causing a scene. I left work, racing home. When I arrived, I found them attempting to break into my house. As soon as I stepped out of the car, Lucas lunged at me, knocking my phone from my hand. Melissa approached, insisting they just wanted to talk. I stayed firm, telling them they could talk, but only from a distance. Melissa started to rant, accusing me of being petty and holding on to the past. She admitted she was insulted that I'd refused to help them and that they'd already liquidated everything they owned to cover their debts, including their house and jewelry. She warned me that they'd be back if they needed more. Lucas, however, took it a step further, demanding I sign a document agreeing to help them whenever they needed it in the future. The audacity stunned me. I outright refused, telling them I wanted nothing to do with them. Lucas grew aggressive, and as I turned to leave, Melissa shoved me, screaming that I owed this to them as family. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived shortly, taking Melissa and Lucas into custody. Though I knew the charges were minor and they'd be out soon, the act itself was cathartic. It felt like the first real justice I'd experienced since they'd shattered my life. Days later, my parents showed up on my doorstep, a shadow of their former selves. My mother was in tears, apologizing, admitting they'd been wrong all those years ago. My father acknowledged that Melissa and Lucas's arrest had been a wake-up call, forcing them to confront the damage they had caused. But even as they apologized, I felt a numbness inside me. I couldn't go back. Their regret was too little, too late. I told them I appreciated their honesty, but I couldn't simply erase the years of betrayal and hurt. I'd made a life for myself without them, and I wasn't willing to change that. They asked if I would at least unblock them, and I reluctantly agreed. But in my heart, I knew things would never be the same. I had moved on, healed my wounds, and found peace. And if they wanted to be a part of my life now, it would be on my terms, distant, guarded, and forever wary of their intentions.